So let's talk through the strongest and weakest boys in the war with a Codex Orks tier list for Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Orks, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of some of the strongest and weakest Orks around, now the Codex and all rules and points costs have been revealed. In this video I'm going to aim to do an overview of what's looking strong in Codex Orks right now, this video covering all the Codex units plus the Gargantua and Squiggoth. Unfortunately for the Grot tanks and other boys, all the other Forge World units have recently been sent to Legends alongside Captain Badrock and a few others, so sadly won't be featuring in this video. In this video I've aimed to sort Ork units into 5 rough tiers worth of datasheet strength. Obviously tier lists in Warhammer 40k are a bit arbitrary, and potentially some things could be ranked a lot higher or lower depending on the army or context. Particularly with the Codex, detachments change a lot of things massively in terms of power. The Ork army in particular feels like it's got real sections that focus around different elements of the army. Obviously the Walkers are far better in Dread Mob, and Knobs and Mega Knobs far better in Bully Boys. For the most part I'm mainly going to focus on datasheet strength, maybe with a bit of a nod towards the detachments that I think are more likely to be competitive ones. Though for units where relevant I'll try and talk about the detachments as we go along, and whether or not I think it might make them go a little bit higher or lower than they were. In any case, let's jump right into it, start with the weakest tier and make our way towards the strongest. First up and ranked down in tier 5, here are the units that just feel standout weak to the point of almost unusability. First up we've got the Big Head Boss Bunker, which is 135 points, basically an orky pillbox to shoot out of, with a bunch of big shooters and a squinty eye. In theory maybe not totally awful for looters to sit and shoot out of, but it's just really nothing worth 135 points. Unfortunately probably needs a good 50 or so points taking off before it's really going to be all that worth it. You're better off with more shooting units, or maybe things that can move around like trucks or battle wagons instead of this guy. For the flyers, the Blitzer Bomber and Burner Bomber didn't receive any help in the Codex. The Blitzer Bomber's 115 points, the Burner Bomber 125. Just in general, it does seem to be an actual design philosophy that Games Workshop does not want flyers to be good in 10th edition right now. Some of them are sort of mediocre, but these aren't them, they're just utterly awful. Their bombing rules are the main attraction, and they can't use them until turn 3, and only then if the opponent obligingly doesn't move out of the way. Their shooting damage output isn't anything to get too excited about, and you're basically better spending your points on just about any other unit in the Codex that will do you better. Kind of a shame as the Ork Jets are kind of fun models, though I would say that the more shooty ones are at least a little bit better than these guys. Moving up into tier 4, these are the units I consider maybe significantly overshadowed, just not really very strong on raw datasheet strength alone. First up, there's some more planes in the Dagger Jet and the Wasbomb Blaster Jet. I do think they're significantly better than the bombers. They can turn up turn 2 and do have at least some reasonably interesting firepower. The Dagger Jet spams out loads of strength 6 damage 1. The Wasbomb a bit more heavy firepower with its teleport blasters or super cannons. The reason to use them will be in Cult of Speed, where they're a fairly big and shooty unit that can use the stratagems quite well. Though even then, and with theoretically kind of good shooting output, it's still not particularly exciting. With the Dagger Jets all hits a critical type thing, in theory that does sound quite good, but it doesn't actually math out to be worth as much as you might expect. And the Wasbomb I don't think is enormously efficient for its firepower. They're both at least fairly easy to take out and return as well, not really having very good defensive profiles. Still though, I'd certainly rate them a bit better compared with the bombers, which are borderline non-functional. Next up, I've also chosen to rank 3 of the buggies down here. I think it was a shame that the October buggies didn't see some sort of datasheet improvement. They are kind of cheap, but they're just not really all that much threat for their cost as well. I've ranked the Boomdacker Snazwagon, Rocketchuck Squig Buggy, and the Custom Booster Blaster down here. The damage output for all of them is just a little bit on the mediocre side. Most enemy units will be able to threaten them at least fairly well. I feel like perhaps one of the most interesting might be the Booster Blaster, as it's the cheapest and also hands out -1 to hit. At least the gun is a little bit more general purpose than the rest. I feel like they didn't really do the Squig Buggy any favours in the Codex. The ignores line of sight firepower lost its +1 to hit against infantry, meaning that it'll barely ever hit anything if it fires out of line of sight. Given that it's 100 points rather than 75 or 80, I would rate the Squig Buggy as the worst. Next up, the Whirboy that comes on the kill rig is 60 points. He does battle shock things to the enemy and tries to fry them with the Eyes of Mork, getting better with more Beast Snagger boys in the unit, though I feel like it only reaches just kind of okay levels when you're all the way up at 20 of them. Just overall, he's the weakest leader for the Beast Snagger boys in my opinion. I think you're far better off with either of the others, particularly the Beast Boss. Finally, for tank busters, they're 110 points. They do have a little bit of okay rocket damage with buffs against vehicles. Being locked to the loadouts that they are though, they're just a really unfocused unit. One has to take rocket pistols and one the tank buster to dilute their firepower. They're incredibly fragile for the cost with just one wound boys here, and they could afford to go down in points by a fairly spectacular amount. I do feel like Games Workshop might be trying to keep them kind of niche with their fine cast kits, though I'm sure at some point in the future they'll eventually get updated to plastic. Moving on to tier 3, I'd rate these guys as significantly better. Units that are kind of usable in the right detachment or the right situation, maybe not stand out though, and I wouldn't usually expect them to be massively staple choices in the army. Maybe a couple of them could be a bit more interesting in the right detachment. First up, we've got the Death Dread, which is 130 points. Its stat lines for the cost just isn't really that great outside of Dread Mob, but is interesting enough inside it. Its change in the Codex was to get Strength 12 on its claws, and 7 attacks at Strength 12, AP 2 and Damage 3 is pretty punchy. You could do a more shooty version with lots of custom Mega Blasters or rocket launchers and things, but I feel like you're probably struggling against the firepower of cans here. The durability is kind of middling. Ideally, you'd probably want to try and keep a cover save with that 2+ armor save, though things like the odd melter gun shot could really ruin its day. Not awful overall for an Orky combat walker though. Death Copters are 100 points per 3 or 200 for 6. They have ranged rocket firepower plus a bunch of strength 5 AP 0 melee damage with their spinning blades. Maybe a little bit on the so-so side just on their raw numbers in damage and defense, but they do go pretty fast and can deep strike if you want to. Definitely a unit that's going to be fairly relevant in Cult of Speed and kind of mediocre outside of it. At a big 200 point squad, you can get some pretty interesting combos on them, perhaps particularly boosting their shooting up close, and of course being able to go even faster. Commandos are 135 points. I feel like they're interesting as the only Orky infiltrate unit besides Snickrot. They're mostly regular-ish boys with a whole bunch of chopper attacks, a few bonus things like Power Claws and the Breacher Ram. They can't be overwatched, and they've got a Distraction Grot and a Bomb Squig for a little bit more value. I feel like for infiltrate units being locked to a mob size of 10 isn't the best really. In general, you want infiltrate screening units to be as cheap as possible so you're not losing big investment if the enemy engages them. And given that Snickrot's a bit more viable solo now he gets lone operative, he's maybe a bit more tempting alone than with these guys. I feel like they could afford to go down in points a fair way. Kind of a shame that they seem a little bit on the more niche side given that they've got such cool models. Next up, for the Orcs with Flamers, we've got the Burner Boys, 60 points per 5 of them, or 120 per 10. They get Mass Flamer Fire, and then some AP-2 Cutting Flames in close combat, and they do get a bonus against enemies on objective markers. They're not too bad for a bit of dedicated anti-infantry, with a drive-by burning out of a truck or a battle wagon perhaps. It is a shame for them that they can't be led by the mechs for Dread Mob, as I think they'd kind of enjoy that. And otherwise I feel like they often just get passed over a bit because in general Orc army lists might be struggling a bit more for dealing with big heavily armoured targets out of the enemy force, more so than lighter things that you can handle with a chopper. Next up we've got the Big Mech with a shock attack gun for 75 points. Again, maybe a bit of a difficult unit to rate. I feel like he's probably better than this point if he is in Dread Mob, but if anything could be even worse than this outside of it. He just doesn't really have all that great damage output unless you're getting additional boosts on it, so it feels very much like a take in Dread Mob but don't otherwise. If you are using that detachment though, he can give the mech keywords to looters in particular, or bear enhancements in a mech gun unit, and still contribute with really quite a big gun of his own. D6 plus 1, strength 9 AP 4 attacks that hit on a 4+ when he's stationary. Being able to reroll hit rolls of 1 is handy enough, though the looters do already get that admittedly. And to me, for those units, he feels like perhaps the better choice compared with the standard Big Mech, given that he's got more serious long-ranged firepower. Probably not one to bother with outside of Dread Mob though. Next up, the Deathkiller War Trike is 80 points, a fairly chunky and melee threatening Orc Trike boss. He gives +1 to hit in melee for the Warbikers that he leads and allows them to advance 6 inches, and advancing 6 inches is really important in Cult of Speed as they get to advance and shoot in that one so you can get all of that Dakka up close and personal extra fast. Getting within 9 inches is big for the Warbikers and doubly so with some of the stratagems there. Otherwise, he does have a bit of melee with a Stagger Claw, though I wouldn't really say that he's particularly stand out in terms of either shooting or melee damage, maybe a bit more slanted towards durability. He can certainly be incredibly tanky in Warhorde with the 4+ Feel No Pain. Between that, the toughness, and the invulnerable save, it's going to take the enemies quite a bit of focus fire to bring him down. Next for the Flash Kits, I was kind of pleased to see them get a points cut given that they lost Badrog. dropping down from 95 to 80 points. They bring the spammed Strength 6, AP 1, Damage 2 shooting with those snaz guns, and then backed up by some actually okay-ish Orky melee with choppers. 4 attacks each at Strength 5, AP 1 isn't really anything to dismiss for lighter infantry. Their shooting can get 1 turn of lethal hits and gets a bit better against the closest targets, gaining another shot. I think for 16 points between range and melee, they're really not too bad. Could certainly maul some lighter infantry, even if, as mentioned, that's not really the thing that Orks tend to be lacking that much. I do feel like a unit that maybe doesn't really have as much special reason to take them versus other stuff. Not having any characters that can lead them definitely isn't a plus, and they don't really have any specific detachment that gives them extra stuff. They don't get the knobs keyword for bully boys, and can't run with mechs for dread mob buffs. Overall not awful, but I feel like usually going to be second place to other things. Next up, the standard Big Mech is 80 points. He's the new model from the Stomper Boys box set originally. He does feel like a bit of an odd datasheet to me, a bunch of special rules that seem to sort of push him in different directions, a little bit of shooting or melee, but not so much that it's actually an efficient threat in his own right, and then you get to reroll shooting hit rolls of 1, and gets to teleport through units, rerolling advanced rolls with his shock booster thing, which I guess could be handy for getting things a little bit more insurance and getting close to melee in the war. But that doesn't really seem enough to justify his entire character. I guess you could maybe use him to give him the mech keywords to a unit of knobs in Dread Mob if you wanted to. Otherwise though, I just feel like you're almost always going to want other characters beyond him, even if he does have a cluster of different buffs and not the worst stat line in the world. Next up, we've got the Pain Boss, basically the Beast Snagger Pain Boy. 60 points for a 5+ feel no pain for his charges, plus that Gross Orderly can allow you to resurrect some boys once per game. It's not quite as big a deal compared with the Pain Boy and regular boys, given that the Beast Snagger boys already get a 6+ feel no pain, so you are sort of getting rid of one buff to replace with his better one. He does have a bit of Power Claw type attacks as well, and it's maybe just okay as a cheapish leader if you don't want to pay the extra points for a Beast Boss. Given that they're only 80 points now though, I feel like that extra 20 points is generally going to be well worth it. I guess he might be a bit more tempting if you're running big 20-man blocks of Beast Snagger boys for some reason, though most people tend to prefer running in 10s. The Hunter rig's 150 points, and it's a cheaper kill rig that misses the Whir Tower off the top. You could transport multiple units of Beast Snagger boys or one big mob of 20 if you wanted to, and otherwise the thing's at least fairly general purpose, a bit of shooting and a bit of melee. The melee gets a little bit better with the Butcher boys getting more attacks when there's models embarked. Realistically though, I don't think there's enough draw to really want you to run it compared with the kill rig. It just seems like by far the better deal with 20 points extra for the Whir Tower, even if you are sacrificing a bit of transport capacity. Next up, there's another couple of perhaps the more interesting buggies. I do feel like I've maybe been a little bit generous to the Shock Jump Dragster. It could possibly have been in tier 4. I feel like if you were running Cult of Speed, which is the main way that you would be running buggies though, it does feel like one of the most interesting ones. He basically gets to advance it every single turn and warp it around the board each turn. Could be good for doing secondaries or getting lines of sight on exactly what it needs to, though admittedly its damage output isn't that great. Otherwise the Scrapjet maybe feels like one of the more dangerous out of the various buggies. It does have a fair bit more shooting than the rest, with the rocket launchers and the wing missiles, plus some big shooters and a bit more threat in melee with mortal wound impact hits and a very slightly boosted strength in the nose drill. I feel like out of any of the things that can use the Cult of Speed buff and sort of want to be on the front line, engaging the enemy, then fall back and attack again, it's probably this thing. Even so though, I wouldn't really rate the damage output as all that standout. It's quite a cheap unit, so it isn't that efficient with stratagems, and I don't think they're going to really do very well outside of Cult of Speed. Next up, we've got the Mech Guns, which maybe got a bit of a side grade in the Codex. They're a tiny bit cheaper now at 50 points rather than 55. The weapon profile's got a bit more balance. The custom Mega Cannon going down to AP-1 was a big blow for that, but the Smasher Gun with its good AP got more shots. And Dread Mob you get some random extra free buffs, and it does get a little bit of a better special rule with reroll ones against things that are at starting strength. I feel like they're okay units to sit in the backfield, but you might not want to overcommit to them given their low mobility. I might be a bit more tempted by the Smasher Guns now for a bit of anti-elite type shooting, as opposed to the custom Mega Cannons that feel like they're going to struggle against the vehicles they want to shoot, given that they're only AP-1 and that's not great with all the cover going around. Finally, I've also chosen to rank the Orky Super Heavies here. The Stomper does remain 800 points, so realistically still it is absolutely overcosted for what it brings to the table, though in Dread Mob it's genuinely not awful now. provided you're playing it on a table where it's got room to maneuver and you're not playing against a foe with so much anti-tank firepower that it's going to get taken down in short order. This thing could be legitimately terrifying against the right army. Give it a mech for +1 ballistic skill, choose the sustained hits buff and fire the 3 main guns, and then throw 1 or 2 of the good shooting stratagems at it, and you've got a serious firepower machine. It can potentially average taking down entire Imperial Knights in a single round of firepower, and that's definitely not all it does, given that it's got crazy strength 24, AP 5 and damage 10 melee to back that up. Still, it does need to do an awful lot of damage and make its presence felt for the big 800 points it has. And as mentioned, the biggest weaknesses for it are that on certain, say, competitive tables with preset terrain, it just might not be able to move virtually at all with its enormous profile. And there will be enemies out there packing excessive anti-tank that could actually kill it and fairly quickly, which would be pretty disastrous losing this much of your army so early. Outside of Dread Mob, it does remain just kind of flat terrible too. Finally, for the tier 3 units, I've also chosen to rank the Gargantuan Squig here. This one's 440 points for the biggest, baddest squig around. In general, it's just a big scary melee cannonball of a unit. 30 wounds at toughness 13 I think is sturdy enough for the points cost. No invulnerable save doesn't help it, but things will struggle to wound it. And whenever it gets to combat, it's got very dangerous melee, with a big 6 attacks with lance and a flat damage 12. Should have a good chance of killing any big stuff that it can catch, and it does have a sweep mode as well. Otherwise, it's got a bit of shooting, and you can hide a mob inside it to charge out, maybe some boys, knobs, or mega knobs. For armies that aren't able to kill this sort of profile in some sort of reasonable time, could be some big issues. They certainly could get slowed down by terrain or screened out by chaff units, both of which would annoy it quite a lot. Moving up to tier 2 next, and these are the units that I feel like are genuinely quite strong Orky units. Some of them still maybe a little bit detachment dependent, some more than others, but I consider these maybe a bit more exciting units in their respective detachments. First up, I've chosen to rank the boys and the Beastnagger boys here. I feel like both of these I'd rank either top of tier 2 or lower tier 1. The standard boys can still provide a whole ton of melee violence, lots of chopper attacks that hit enemy infantry hard, even nastier in the war, and they do have a lot of toughness 5 wounds that the enemy will take time to chew through, with objective control 2 to secure the points until they do. They've got access to good bosses and good transports. I feel like if anything, the war boss and the beast boss maybe carried the unit more so than the boys them. And they've got good transports to get to the fight, either trucks, battle wagons, or kill rigs. The standard boys mob got a better special rule as well with the sticky objectives rule. That can make them kind of tempting to have at least one unit in the army, even if it's just for that. And they are the central unit in Green Tide as well, which currently I'm not convinced is going to be the single strongest way to play Orcs or anything, but if you're trying to make that work, then you're probably going to have 120 of them in a 2k list. Otherwise, Beastnaggers are maybe a bit more rounded and dangerous. They get damage buffs versus tough stuff, an extra pip of strength, and their built-in feel no pain, though they do pay for that with more points. Overall, standard Orcs are still pretty good to put on the table. I could have happily put them either here or tier 1. Next up for the looters, they're 50 points for 5 or 100 points per 10. Again, really a unit that I consider good in Dread Mob, but far less good elsewhere. In Dread Mob, you want to put a mech with them. I'd be tempted by the Shock Attack Gun mech, and that could get you a fairly scary and not really all that expensive firepower unit. They can make great use of any of the buffs, and maybe the Ignores cover stratagem as well. They really like sustained hits and lethal hits, and that's particularly nice given that they get to reroll all hit rolls against things that are standing on objectives. Really nice for 3 shots of those def guns at strength 8, AP 1, damage 2. Plus maybe the Spanner Boys contributing a few rockets. They maybe aren't enormously general purpose, the damage profile just isn't that great against things like high saves in cover or high toughness. And it does have the disadvantage of dropping off quite a lot when they move. Hitting on 6s isn't fun, even if you do get fun damage boost on those 6s. For just 10 points per model, I think they could be worse though I do think that they need the Dread Mob buffs to actually get good. Next up, we've got the War Bikes at 70 points per 3 or 140 per 6. They're cheap and fast moving little skirmishers that are good against infantry, a little bit of range and a bit of melee with a power claw and some choppers. I had seen a few Orc lists using these prior to the Codex drop. They are handy enough for objective skirmishing and reaching board positions to do secondaries, maybe competing with Storm Boys a little bit for that role, which a lot of people do seem to prefer, and admittedly they got buffed in the Codex. Still though, I think they're solid enough, not unusable at all, and they'll be fairly central if you're using Cult of Speed as well. Some of the stratagems being quite nice for them, and really quite good with the Death Killer War Trike, which can bear the enhancements for the detachment. Next up, and maybe the standout unit of Dread Mob, are the Killer Cans. 125 points for 3 of these grots in cans. They get a fair bunch of medium toughness, 3+ save wounds on the table, and strike with a bunch of rocket shots, and then a whole load of damage 3 attacks in melee. The mid strength and mid AP attacks with high damage are kind of the exact sort of thing that the Dread Mob buffs will be good for. They like sustained hits, lethal hits, and extra AP. They could be good for the +1 strength warner in close combat, which could get them up to strength 10, and otherwise can be quite efficient with stratagems in general at a 250 point unit of 6 of them. They can maybe be a bit bulky in game, and their big bases can get in the way of each other a little bit, which might not be ideal if they're trying to advance up the board and things are trying to move block them. But in general, they seem like at least a fairly good frontline unit, perhaps the equivalent of foot troops for the Can Horde. Otherwise, and maybe ranked perhaps a little bit below the Killer Cans, are the Morkanaut and Gorkanaut. These two could be big focal units for the Dread Mob. They're still big models, but they're significantly less big than the Stomper, meaning that they'll function on normal sized boards a fair bit easily, their night sized bases being a bit more likely to fit through gaps. I feel like out of the two, the Morkanaut is maybe the more interesting in Dread Mob, given that it's got some pretty nasty general purpose shooting that can make good use of their stratagems and the shooting buffs, and getting a better invulnerable save isn't unhelpful either. I suspect the Gorkanaut will be my second choice, but if you need more infantry clearance, it does have that 30 shot shooter, and it does have the better melee out of the two, and is also slightly cheaper as well, so there's definitely draws to taking that one as well. They both have transport capacity as well, and get +1 to hit in the war, either at range or in melee. Outside of Dread Mob, I still wouldn't really consider them all that impressive, probably down at tier 3 outside of that, but seem like one of the better units to use as a focal target for stratagems there. Next up, we've got the big lumbering squig that is the Kill Rig, a big and fairly dangerous transport to get some Beast Snagger boys and a boss into melee, while providing a bit of melee threat in itself, and this one, unlike the Hunter Rig, gets that Whir Tower with the auto-hitting Strength 12, AP 3 and Damage D6 that's going to leave a mark on just about anything. As it auto-hits, it can be quite nasty with Overwatch as well, potentially smashing a few enemies on their turn. Otherwise, Spirit of Gork can amp up your melee a little bit nearby, and overall I feel like the combined offering isn't too bad for 170 points. Maybe it's a bit dependent on you wanting to use Beast Snagger boys to jump out of it into melee though. For 160 points we have the Battle Wagon, generally going to be a debate between this one and the Truck, and I think they're both alright. For 160 points it's genuinely quite tanky, 16 wounds, toughness 12 if you take the hard case, and it gets its special rule to worsen enemy AP, and between all that it's going to take a lot of punishment before it gets taken out. Unlike the Truck, it's got an extra big transport capacity of all the way up to 22, so you could have a lot of orcs in there. Maybe it could be nice for maxed out Meganob squads with attached characters. It does have a bit of melee with the Death Roller, plus its Grabbing Claw and Wrecking Ball, and a fair bit of inaccurate shooting. Perhaps the biggest weakness is that you could just use a Truck to get your boys into battle for far cheaper. This one maybe does have a bit more reliable insurance though. It's not going to get taken out without a fair bit of focused firepower. For 45 points we've got the Standard Orc Mech, basically acting as the equivalent of an Orky Tech Marine to standby vehicles, giving them +1 to hit and also a bit of repairing. Seems reasonable enough to have along if you've got some very big scary vehicles. Now the Forge World things have gone away though, it's likely the Gorkanaut, Morkanaut and the Stomper that are going to be relevant for that. On things lesser than that it's probably not worth the investment. Here's absolutely also included for the Stomper though, getting an 800 point unit to hit on 4s rather than 5s, adds 50% to its firepower, so why would you not take one? The pseudo-lone operative type protection that it gets can be handy enough for objectives as well, provided you can keep a vehicle nearby to stop him getting shot down. Next up we've got the Mega Armored characters, the Big Mech in Mega Armor and the War Boss in Mega Armor. I feel like both of these guys maybe aren't quite as standout as the actual unit that they're leading. Maybe the value comes a bit more than them rather than these two, at least for the points that you pay for them. The Big Mech does do some really interesting stuff. He's 100 points and gives you a custom force field, reroll hit rolls of 1, repairing Meganobs like an apothecary, and also healing 1 once per game. It has become very pricey indeed though. At 100 points, you're unlikely to ever recoup your value from this guy literally by healing Meganobs, and does mean that you might just be a bit better placed in taking more of them rather than him. At the 85 points that he was before, I think he would have been standout great. At 100 points, perhaps a bit less so. Still seems usable and strong though. Otherwise, the Mega Armored War Boss is 80 points. He gets his huge chopper, which now gets extra damage in the war. +1 to hit for Mega Knobs is really quite big, given that they hit on a 4+ normally, and if you just wanted a bit more chunky fighting power in the unit, then he's not a bad choice. The Mega Armoured War Boss is quite good for getting deep strike in the units in Bully Boys as well, as that's an enhancement that's locked to him. Overall, I feel like both of these are good, and maybe a bit more balanced. Now the Big Mech and Mega Armor went up in points cost. I definitely feel like they could be pretty relevant to get enhancements in the Mega Knobs unit. Next up, maybe in a similar kind of vein, is the Beast Boss on Squigosaur and Mozrog Scragbad, 130 points and 165 points. In the Codex, their stat lines were toned down really quite significantly, without as much raw toughness, given that they're leader characters now, as opposed to having to just go it alone and weather all the enemy firepower. Their damage output stayed kind of similar though, so they're still pretty dangerous for the points cost. The Beast Boss on Squigosaur can be used to get enhancements into a massive 450 point unit if you max them out, which is kind of scary. And otherwise, they both bring their special rules to the unit, Mozrog with fights on death, the Beast Boss with the extra movement on advancing. Their combat's fairly general purpose, they've got the anti-keywords to help deal with enemy tanks and vehicles, though with low AP that can mean that they can bounce a bit against 2+ save things, really quite dependent on how the opponent rolls with their saves, or if you manage to get any devastating wounds with the Squigosaurs. Overall, again, like the Mega Armored characters, maybe doesn't feel quite as much value compared with the actual Squighogs themselves, and buying them in does mean that you're committing to really quite a big and hefty unit of them, even running the Squighogs cheap at 160 points, and that might be more than you really need for their role. Next up, we've got the big boss himself in Ghazghkull Thraka, 235 points, as the Prophet of the War himself. His melee stats are really quite scary. It's nice that he gained a sweep mode for Gork's Claw to allow himself to be pretty good against Space Marines as well against tough stuff, and he does make his unit hit really quite a lot better, +1 to hit and wounds, and better critical hits in the War, even more so with Makari's lethal hits. Makari himself is pretty handy to have around, given that he gets his 2+ invulnerable save until you get unlucky. I feel like he might have more relevance than before, both because of his boost and also because Mega Knobs are pretty interesting with their 4+ feel no pain now. It is a shame that they don't appear to have fixed his transport issues. Feels like the intention was that he should be able to hitch a ride in a battle wagon with 2 Mega Knobs in attendance, though that isn't what they've written. Unless they decide to rectify that, he's generally going to need 2 foot slog, which could be a little bit annoying with his big base. At least he's got the infantry keyword for some slightly better interaction with terrain though. Next up, for 70 points, we've got the Pain Boy, perhaps more relevant in Green Tide versus the other detachments. If you've got 20 boys, then a 5+ feel no pain seems like a great idea, particularly if they've already got a 5+ invulnerable save protecting them against high AP multi-damage things. He also gets to heal some boys once per game, provides some extra claw attacks to his units, plus the chance for some nasty mortal wounds if he injects someone properly with his Urti syringe. He does feel maybe a little bit niche though compared with the War Boss. I think in most smaller mobs of boys you're probably going to be better off with a War Boss versus him. He's only really going to come into his own in 20 strong mobs, which you're far more likely to see in Green Tide versus elsewhere. I'd probably rate him towards the lower end of this tier, or tier 3 perhaps. For 55 points, we've got the Weird Boy. He can only lead boys, and his main thing is da jump, warping the boys around the board, which could potentially lead you with first turn charges. He could combo pretty nicely with that +2 to charge stratagem in Warhorde. Might mean that you get a 7-inch charge out of Deep Strike there. Besides that, he got a little bit of melee and that sniping Edbanger attack. Having a Horde kind of unit that can redeploy like that's really quite cool. Could mean that you could threaten some unusual charges or pop up against the exact thing that the opponent doesn't want them fighting in combat. He is going to be a little bit unreliable in getting the boys to the fight though. That 7-inch charge is only in one detachment and does cost resources, and that means that you might need to double down with an extra CP if you still happen to roll low with it. Lastly for this tier, and maybe again a bit borderline hero tier 3, is Zodgrod Wartsnagger. He's definitely got the fun factor, 160 points for him and 20 Gretchen and 2 Run Herds. That basically gives you one big annoying blob of chaff, 23 models with -1 to wound, scout 9 inches, objective control 2, and +1 to hit and wound with all of their attacks, including Zodgrod's own strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 claw, so he does have a bit of threat in melee against most normal size units. He is still perhaps a bit costly for all that, and the super runs are still going to die to any sort of focused anti-infantry fire, and the damage output still isn't great. But having said all that, that is still a whole load of bodies to put into the midfield with lots of objective control. It's often going to take the opponent a couple of turns to chew through all that, and if they match up against the right opponent, they might actually be able to destroy some enemy objective takers that underestimate the runs. Maybe tier 2 is still a little bit generous, but I think he's quite fun. I feel like most games he's going to be able to secure at least a few victory points in the midfield for a while. Moving on though, and getting into tier 1, here are the Orky units that are perhaps considered the top tier picks at the moment. Datasheets that broadly look like they're going to be strong regardless of detachment, though get extra strong in certain ones. First up, there's the standard Beast Boss and standard War Boss, both just crazily good value for their points in my opinion. The Beast Boss was 100 points and dropped down to 80, the War Boss is maintained at that very cheap 65. They're both nice and fighty with their power claws. The standard boss gets the extra attack squigs, and the beast boss gets the option of swinging with the beast chopper if it makes more sense. They give +1 to hit for their lead squad, which is a nice general purpose melee buff. And then they both have their own damage, with the war boss getting a big boost with lots more attacks than the war, as if he weren't already dangerous enough there. The beast boss gets the devastating wounds on the charge, which is really big with the anti-keywords, and definitely gives him a good chance to just solo a big tank or monster. They're going to be relevant in the vast majority of Ork detachments. Warhorde, Bully Boys, Green Tide, or the Big Hunts can all have good use for them, and there's lots of good enhancements to make them more dangerous. Overall, I feel like we're still probably going to be seeing quite a lot of bosses on the table. Next up, one of the more standout units of the new codex does seem to be the Mega Knobs. They stayed at 30 points, which was already kind of tanky for their stat line with a toughness 6 and 2+ save with 3 wounds. And while perhaps their damage output isn't spectacular, with low volumes of attacks hitting on 4s, they still will chew through things in a medium-sized unit with a bunch of Power Claw or Kill Saw hits. The big thing that they gained, though, was a 4+ Feel No Pain type save in the turns of the war, which just makes them immensely more durable in the turn when they first engage the enemy. And that just gets doubled down on in Bully Boys, where they get 2 turns of that, and plus they also get an Armor of Contempt stratagem as well. As mentioned, they've got 2 usable characters in the Mega Armored War Boss and the Big Mech in Mega Armor, extra damage from the War Boss and extra defense from the Big Mech. Their slow movement can be got around by getting them in transports, where they can just take cheap trucks to get them up the board, which is nice. And they could even be a good target for that move, drop, charge enhancement in Cult of Speed. Otherwise though, Warhorde just gives them extra melee damage and plenty of useful stratagems. -1 to wound could be really quite big in the turn of the war with a 4+ Feel No Pain. They're not going anywhere then. And they do have what looks like a fairly janky combo in Green Tide as well. The boss takes an enhancement that allows them to count as 10 models or more, and that allows them to reroll saving throws of 1, could be really big against any low AP things when they're saving on a 2+ anyway. Overall, they certainly seem like a unit to watch, definitely feel like a force to be reckoned with in Bully Boys. 540 points for 18 of these with a 4+ Feel No Pain for 2 turns does seem like a massive menace in the midfield, particularly when they're getting the fairly insane combat boost of the War for 2 turns in a row to break things with. Next up, we've got the lowly Gretchen that remain one of the best units in the codex in my opinion. 11 models with objective control 2 for 40 points is a great start. It's not even like their leadership's terrible either at leadership 7. Really quite nice for securing a home field objective or just throwing a whole bunch of chaff towards a midfield point if that makes more sense. Then the opportunity to farm command points on a 4+ for their objective is really big. Basically means that at least some Gretchen are pretty much auto-include to sit on a home field objective, never mind if you want some more to do screening things or secondary things in the midboard. I feel like 40 points for 11 models is hard to go too far wrong with. They're often just going to cause the opponent more trouble to deal with them than they're really worth. And if you wanted, you could go for some sort of meme Gretchen list in the Dread Mob, making them battle line and getting potentially 132 models on the board for a perhaps surprisingly non-costly 480 points. Next up for 65 points is the Trog. It's been cheap and effective since the start of 10th edition, and despite going up a little bit, it still does its job very well. Transport for 12 greenskins, a 12-inch move to get them up the board fast, and then at least a somewhat sturdy vehicle that they can jump out of and get to scrapping with the enemy over the objectives. The Wrecking Ball is quite a nice thing to have, as it means it can threaten some slightly heavier tank shock than normal, and it repairs wounds over time. Maybe the biggest weakness is that if it gets exposed, any sort of serious anti-tank firepower will make some very short work of it, and you could have some valuable things foot slogging, which wouldn't be great. That's not really too unexpected for 65 points though, it will just have to play a little bit cagey with positioning. For 85 points I've chosen to list Boss Snickrot here. Maybe top tier might be a little bit generous for him, but I feel like him gaining Lone Operative in the Codex was a really big change. Previously, Orks couldn't access any lone operatives besides things like the mech stood by a big vehicle, and quite nice to have an option for a unit that just can't be shot at long range. They're just generally handy to have hanging around the backfield often, for screening units that the opponent can't engage, handy for doing secondaries, and it's not like he doesn't have a bit of his own damage output with Mork's teeth to chew through an entire infantry squad. On top of that, he can function almost a little bit like an Orky Calidus assassin. He only gets one redeploy once per game, but is a fair bit tankier than that Imperial assassin, and still has some good threat of his own. In general, seems like a handy enough unit to have around for 85 points. I have a feeling that we'll see at least some top lists use him. Maybe doesn't quite feel auto-include at 85 points with just the one redeploy though. I think I'd either rate him at the top of tier 2 or the lower end of tier 1. Next up, and their points cost going back down to 105 points in the Codex, are the Knobs. These guys have been a bit of a powerhouse of Orky melee for the last few months in the edition. Really quite dangerous with a war boss giving them -1 to wounds, and a whole load of power claw attacks that can threaten to tear down the biggest things in the opponent's army in one turn if they have a good roll. They generally want a truck or wagon to get them into close combat, and I feel like they're going to remain very effective with multiple formations. They're really good with bully boys, getting the 2 turns worth of war, which is massive, plus some good supporting stratagems. Warhorde will be great for them with the sustained hits and all the useful stratagems, and in Coulter Speed they could potentially use the truck boys thing to do the disembark and charge. Overall they do seem pretty strong. I feel like they've got far more competition with the Mega Knobs though for the Orky elites to do melee violence to the enemy. Will be interesting to see if the Mega Knobs with their Feel No Pain steal their thunder a little bit. Next up, we've got the Squig Hog boys. They had the change of the knob with Smasher Squig being consolidated into the unit, and that gives you an 160 point squad with 4 models in it. Really quite tanky with toughness 7 and a 5+ Feel No Pain. They're really hard to wipe out with the -1 to wound in Warhorde, and particularly if they're in the War for an invulnerable save. They're fairly fast moving as cavalry, and they have general purpose melee with the anti-keywords to keep them relevant against vehicles. They've got a bunch of damage too with the stickers and the Knobs chopper. They've got a tiny bit of shooting with those thrown javelins plus the bomb squig, and you can use either Mozrog, Scragbad, or the Beast Boss on Squigosaur to lead them. Could be interesting with certain detachments as well. They might not be the core unit for bully boys, but 2 turns of war on these guys is pretty immense just in itself. Otherwise, they'll be nice in Warhorde, and they've got some good stratagem support dedicated to them in their Big Hunt as well. Though I do suspect that the Beast Snagger one might not be one of the most commonly run competitive detachments. In general though, they were 125 points before, and kind of fine. Gaining the addition of the bigger and nastier knob with the Smasher Squig into the unit just for 35 points more than that feels like overall a good deal. These guys can definitely soak up a lot of firepower before they get taken down. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the well-drilled Storm Boys. Boss Zagstrup might have flown his vulture claws off into the sunset, but the rank and file of these well-drilled orcs still do pretty well in game. 65 points per unit of 5 of them, 130 per 10. They're really quite fast with their 12-inch movement, the infantry keyword, and the ability to advance and charge just at base now. Plus they can be just pretty great secondary objectives. The fast movement is nice, but also built-in deep strike on a relatively cheap unit can be nice for that. Lots of competitive Orca army lists often tend to take like 2 smaller units of them to do the secondary objectives, while the rest of the boys get stuck in. They can still threaten a bit of their own melee themselves. They do have regular choppers plus a power claw in the unit. Quite nice they no longer have to risk taking casualties when they advance and charge, and also gained fallback and charge from the Codex as well as another small boost to an already fairly good squad. In general, I'd be more tempted to use them as smaller units for objectives and things. They can certainly get the job done pretty fast. In any case, with the top tier stuff talked about, that just about brings us to the end of a quick look through the units of the Orky Codex. Let me know what you make of them down in the comments below. Are these how you'd rate them yourselves, or would you put anything a bit higher or lower? Certainly welcome any different opinions. I'm sure I'll be back for some other Orky videos in the not too distant future. Will be interesting to take a look at a few more detachments, maybe Dread Mob might be next. I'll look forward to taking a look at a few army lists once people start to hit tournaments with them. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see any of that. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.